So after this one, the next one's what, 7?
I think most people have gotten their coffee and cookies by now, but if you haven't, please feel free to do that. We are going to get started here.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Sharon Bedsworth. I'm the director of the Wimberley School of Religion here at Oklahoma City University and a professor of religion. And we're delighted to welcome you to the second of 3 Willson Lectures. The Willson Lectures is one of the 2 annual lecture series we have here at OCU in the School of Religion. Our other is the Neustadt Lectures, which will be coming up in February, just a plug there. So look for more information about that. But this Willson Lectureship is provided by an endowment by James and Mavis Willson. The lectures are directed to the interest of students and the community and church members in the areas of religion and society. The Wilsons were outstanding members of their United Methodist Church. They gave their gift in 1953, and since that time we've had a wide variety of speakers. We were realizing at lunch that our current speaker's preaching professor, Fred Craddock, had once given the Willson Lectures, and he's a very well-known, esteemed lecturer. We've had Amy Jill Levine, and who's a New Testament scholar, and Warren Carter, who's a New Testament scholar, and a whole variety of other persons as well. But today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Robin Meyers, who is the retired senior minister of Mayflower United Church of Christ here in Oklahoma City, and is tenured distinguished professor of social justice emeritus in the philosophy department here at the university. He's a best-selling author of 8 books about religion and American culture, some of the most recent being Saving Jesus from the Church, How the Church Can Stop Worshiping Christ and Start Following Jesus, The Underground Church, Reclaiming the Subversive Way of Jesus, Spiritual Defiance, A Building of the Beloved Community of Resistance, and Saving God from Religion, a minister's search for faith in a skeptical age. He's a fellow of the Westar Institute, better known as the home of the Jesus Seminar. He's done columnist, newspaper columnist, commentator for NPR. He lectures nationally and internationally about progressive Christianity, including the Lyman Beecher Lectures at Yale University, which is one of the most distinguished academic lectures to be invited to give in the U.S. And he is the subject of a feature-length documentary about the unlikely success of progressive Christianity in Oklahoma, perhaps one of the country's most religiously conservative places. That's entitled American Heretics, The Politics of the Gospel. Highly recommended. You can go Google it. It's probably on YouTube. Yes? Yes. And with that, I present to you Dr. Meyers.
Thank you, Sharon. Let me begin by saying again how grateful I am to get the chance to give the Willson Lectures and how much I appreciate those of you who actually showed up to hear them, whether in person or however we are putting this, simulcasting this, to all of you out there watching. I want to greet you as well. My hope is that nothing I'm about to say will put you under surveillance by the House Committee on Unorthodox Clergy Activities, but I can't guarantee it. I was told once by a woman in Edmond, I always like to make these examples in Edmond, that the church I pastored for 35 years had a really big heart and helped lots of people, but that unfortunately it was also the #1 church in Oklahoma when it comes to increasing the population of hell. Satan loves you, Robin, she said, to which I responded, I'm glad somebody does. Now, first things first, the lecture is entitled, What is Radical Theology? And it's dedicated to the memory of our beloved colleague and teacher of religion, John Starkey. I think he was a radical theologian in the best sense of the word, which I hope to be able to explain. But this dedication is not just sentimental. It's also because there's a connection between this topic and Professor Starkey. I'm drawing heavily from the work of a renowned scholar that John Starkey loved. His name is John Caputo. He prefers to be called Jack. And Caputo is the Thomas J. Watson Professor of Religion Emeritus from Syracuse University and the David R. Cook Professor of Philosophy Emeritus from Villanova University. So he's kind of a hybrid philosopher, theologian who works in the area of radical theology. And he's the author of many books, perhaps the most well-known of which is entitled The Weakness of God. I told Professor Starkey one day that I was going to a conference and I was going to have dinner with Jack Caputo, and his eyes just got huge. And he said, "No, you're not, are you?" And then he said, "Robin, would you," he wouldn't even know me, but would you, his work's been so important to me, would you mind just maybe taking a selfie, the two of you, a selfie, and bring it back to me? So I did, and he treasured that photo, and then a short time later, he was gone. So all of this is to say that on so many levels, this feels right. This is for you, Dr. Starkey. Okay, let's push into deep water quickly, because life is too short to spend much time in the shallow end of the pool. Here are the first few words out of a new book that Jack Caputo is writing about radical theology. God does not exist. The most important thing that we can say about God is that God does not exist. But, keep listening, this does not spell the end of theology, but the beginning of a genuinely radical theology. God, the God we grew up with, the supreme being, omniscient and omnipotent with all the other omni attributes, who sees all, knows all, can do all, is watching every move we make, to whom we turn when things take a turn for the worse, all that does not exist. But that does not mean there is nothing to God. Something important is going on here, if only we can figure it out. It's called radical theology. Caputo goes on, "My intentions are good, and I believe we are doing God a service. Today, God, sad to say, has fallen into the wrong hands. The ally and support of unsavory, anti-scientific, God and guns, white Christian supremacists, nocturnal forces pretending to be the light of the world. God deserves better. God is fast becoming God's own worst enemy. Belief in God is making itself more and more unbelievable, turning itself into a theme park theology that is emptying the churches and leaving God in tears, weeping over Jerusalem, the real one and all the other ones it stands for. So, this is addressed to those who rightly find that God unbelievable, but are not reduced to believing in nothing at all, and are trying to work out what they do believe. The answer to their prayers, I propose, is radical theology, which begins by saying that God, the supreme being, does not exist, but it does not end there. All right, so perhaps you're thinking to yourself right now, so, Robin, are you an atheist? If so, how did you get ordained? Or what is an atheist doing giving the Willson Lectures? That's a fair question. But first we need to do a little remedial work on the word atheist. Literally, atheist or non-theist. Theism is defined as, quote, belief in the existence of a God or gods, especially belief in one God as creator of the universe, intervening in and sustaining a personal relation to his creatures, end quote. Now, I like the one God idea, as well as the creator of the universe idea, since, well, here we are. But there are two words in that definition that pushed me out of the theistic camp and into the radical theology wilderness. One is intervening, and the other is personal. First, I do not believe that God directly intervenes in the world. That is, I do not believe that God takes action as an autonomous entity to make certain things happen that would not have happened had God not acted. And second, I do not believe that God has a personal relationship with anyone, myself included, because I don't believe that God is a person, no matter how appealing that idea might be. I say appealing because I'm a person and you are persons, and how can we be expected to have any kind of a relationship with anything that is not personal? I don't want to pray to the flying spaghetti monster or some nebulous spirit that never calls me back. Besides, I grew up in the non-instrumental Church of Christ, not to be confused with the United Church of Christ, the son of a minister and a professor. I was a double PK. And all of the language that I heard in worship growing up, from the time I was a little boy, reinforced the idea that God is a person, albeit a very large and powerful person. And a man, of course, since all the pronouns were masculine, and almost all the iconography depicted God as some version of a bearded, white, European elder. And if you're looking at the work of Michelangelo on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, God is surprisingly buff. As if there's like a 24-hour gym in heaven somewhere. So as I said in the sermon, although we talk often in the church about being made in the image of God, imago Dei, what I've noticed more and more as I've gotten older is that mostly we have created, humans have created God in our image as a thoroughly human projection, as Ludwig Feuerbach put it, and this has done God no favors. So that not only are we raised to believe that God looks like us, well, unless we are black, brown, female, non-binary, or even non-human for starters, but we think also God plays favorites like our human fathers did. That God has the apples of God's eye, if you will, his chosen children, his favorites, the ones to whom he gives, like land, for example, that's already inhabited by other people. But hey, that's okay because, well, they are the unchosen. And let's face it, it's a terrible thing in this world to be unchosen. Ask the Uyghurs, the Kurds, the Palestinians, women and girls all over the world, LGBTQ plus people, Native Americans, Asians, the Irish in early America, people with disabilities, the list goes on and on. Chosenness is a human invention dressed up to look like God's idea, like manifest destiny. And it gives divine sanction to cruelty and injustice. We have all heard the saying that it's the winners who write history, to which I'm going to add my own. It is the chosen who write Scripture. So, what does this have to do with radical theology? For starters, it means that when we want to make an argument, we reason by constructing what the Greeks called enthymemes, or assumed premises, in syllogistic logic. These are widely, if not universally accepted truths that form the major premises of deductive arguments, the most familiar of which we all know. All men are mortal, major premise. Socrates is a man, minor premise. Therefore, conclusion, Socrates is mortal. Very often, the major premise, all men are mortal, just gets dropped because it can be assumed. It's an enthymeme. E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E. Makes a great password for your computer because no one's ever heard of it. But you should add a few extra characters. All humans die. We all know that. So at least as far as we know, so all people are mortal. And all humans are mortal, not all men, just all men. So we can just get on with the argument in a shorter form and just start with Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. No need to state the major premise. It is assumed. But what happens, I'm fond of asking my students this question, if any of our assumed premises turn out not to be true? For example, take some of the most common enthymemes in American culture. 1, money trickles down. 2, more guns will make us safer. Or 3, the marketplace can solve all the problems of life. The first is the assumed premise of the Republican Party, the second of the National Rifle Association, and the third of the Chamber of Commerce. When we discuss this in class, a hand always goes up and one of my students will say, well, Dr. Meyers, I think there is absolutely no economic data whatsoever to prove that money trickles down. Just the opposite. It mostly trickles up. Another student may quote Sarah Brady, who became a gun control advocate after her husband was wounded in the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. Sarah said, quote, if more guns would make us safer, then wouldn't America already be the safest nation on earth? What are you going to do with that? That's pretty good logic. Perhaps another student will say about the marketplace, it's not magic, like an invisible hand, nor does it have a built-in conscience. Without regulation, it is predatory, even Darwinian. Now the richest 1% of humans on the planet have twice the wealth of the rest of humanity combined, and they don't pay taxes. What you may be asking is, this got to do with radical theology? My answer would be that God is, for most religious people on planet Earth, the ultimate assumed premise. God is the ultimate enthymeme. And the premise, God exists, is the granddaddy of all major premises. So, what if that is not true? That is, what if God does not exist like other things exist? Because you know the parameters of the definition of the word to exist. It means that once you did not, something else brought this thing into being, and one day this thing will not exist, which is rather troubling when you apply that to God. So what happens to theology when one decides that this idea of God as sovereign and supreme being dies? Caputo says that's when radical theology begins. Now, by radical, I do not mean left wing or right wing or any other kind of wing. I do not mean theology that marches in the streets necessarily, although I come from an age when theologians often did just that, including Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who believed that when he was marching with King, he was, quote, praying with his feet. I also do not mean by radical theology that we just go around trashing traditional theology just to get a rise out of the elders, so that you'll feel like a mad prophet decrying the hypocrisies of our time, as William Sloane Coffin Jr. put it. This is not atheism to shock people who have everything to lose if the big sky daddy goes away. This is what Caputo calls, and this is, I think, a sort of rather shocking phrase, theological atheism. That's a phrase I'm fairly certain none of you have ever heard before, where, quote, atheism does theological service as a first step, not the last, on the way to radical theology. It represents a kind of proto-religion, an attempt to make contact with something primal and primordial, prior to God and the gods, religion and anti-religion, religious and secular. It all comes before that. So radical theology is radical thinking, literally daring to think, which I didn't know this, but that was the motto of the Enlightenment, daring to think. It's also a new Enlightenment, which is enlightened about the old Enlightenment, and what Caputo calls his bifold bet, which is, 1, if we think radically enough, we will eventually hit theological ground. The challenge for thinking here is not to be stampeded by the word theology. If it is, then thinking ends up with its own kind of dogmatism. That's the old Enlightenment. 2, if we do theology and keep thinking, we will hit radical ground. The challenge for theology here is not to be stampeded by the word radical, to keep thinking, because theology is a field mined with all kinds of authoritarian conversation stoppers like orthodoxy and heresy, inerrant and infallible, where dare to think is a threat. Just you dare and you will rue the day. I think it is fair to say in my 30 years of teaching here at OCU that I have met more than a few students who've been urged by their parents to use their minds to ask any and all questions except when it comes to faith, which is one of the only areas of human inquiry where not all forms of inquiry are welcome, so that faith is too easily confused with certainty, when in fact, if one is absolutely certain, one needs absolutely no faith whatsoever. What I think the church must do now to have any chance to survive in any form is to have an honest-to-God conversation about God. Some of you will recognize Honest to God as the title of a groundbreaking and controversial book written in the early 1960s by Anglican Bishop John A.T. Robinson. He preceded and greatly influenced Bishop John Shelby Spong, who died just a few weeks ago. Honest to God was one of the first books my father gave to me to read when I announced, to everyone's shock, that I was headed off to seminary. As it turns out, Bishop Robinson's wife had encouraged him to write it because she had grown weary of him coming home day after day to unload on her all the things he no longer believed about God. So she said, well, why don't you write a book about it? Other people may feel exactly as you do, even clergy. Turns out she was right, as women so often are by virtue of their obvious and superior powers of intuition. Can I get an amen? And if I may make an aside here, I think that unfortunately, much higher education in our time is understood as a kind of intellectual and cultural assembly line. That is, we imagine our students as not fully formed automobiles who line up and enter these hallowed halls where the faculty stand ready to add all sorts of essential parts, including the base package we call general education, combined with the engine of their major, and then we roll them out of the assembly line at graduation, knowing we've done our best to make them roadworthy. I think that's the model. Then real life happens, and often our graduates make one of two decisions. One, they leave behind their faith traditions as a fairy tale, or organized religion's best efforts to control their wilder or more deviant capacities. Or two, they sense that they've been lied to about what faith really is to begin with, but they still want to know the truth. The first group becomes part of the growing legion of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those who check none when asked about their religious affiliation, while the second group often start digging deeper into their particular traditions, unwilling to be told what to think while also refusing to give up thinking, especially about matters of ultimate concern. Those folks are often labeled as heretics, when in fact that word just means to choose, when in fact what they are is radical in the best sense of the word, from radix, meaning root. That's where radical comes from. They dig deeper into their traditions until they hit radical stratum. They are not just trashing their traditions, they're trying to recover their traditions, suffering as they do from sclerosis of their theological arteries. I think higher education, as an assembly line, has it exactly backwards. I think our students ought to come here not to be assembled, but to be disassembled. Carefully, respectfully, graciously separated from all the things they think they know that just ain't so. Until at the end of the line at graduation, they don't toss their caps into the air and rev their engines like masters of the universe ready to put the pedal to the metal, but rather they limp forward, bruised and damaged, to get their degrees, looking only half as shiny as when they arrived and full of more questions than answers. Then we will have done our job. As such, you'll be able to recognize an OCU grad not because they're the best versions of themselves, but because they are now a much humbler version of their previous selves. They now know how to say, and are not afraid to say, I don't know. 3 of the most powerful words in the world. You ought to try it sometime. I don't know. When you get ready to ask me questions, that's probably all I'll know to say. I don't know. I realize that this is not what OCU or any college or university for that matter puts on their recruiting brochure. We're going to disassemble you and you're going to limp out of here. But perhaps we should. Something like, come for the disorientation, leave for the reorientation. So this is why I'm not a college recruiter. Dr. Starkey knew this from his work on the Tao Te Ching, whose author Lao Tse knew that when you think you know, that is when you do not know. But when you know that you do not know, that is when you know. When orthodoxy itself fails on a massive scale, it is no longer orthodoxy, but something that more resembles our continued fondness for Santa Claus and the tooth fairy. As the death of organized religion continues unabated, the time has come again, I think, for anyone who wishes to work in or belong to a spiritual community to do exactly what Jesus did, which was to produce a heterodoxical disturbance within it, like a theological Trojan horse. Besides, why should any of us fear such a disturbance? All growth is disassembly that precedes reassembly, or disorientation that precedes reorientation. Otherwise, why would Jesus have taught his followers primarily in parables? The church that was later founded in the name of this heterodoxical Nazarene must never forget that so far as we know, Jesus preached only one indoor sermon. The sad tale is recorded in Luke 4, after which he was almost killed by the congregation. After which he hit the road, never returning again to sit inside and scribble on his bulletin. He walked away from what religion had become in his time and became a disturber of the orthodox peace. It needed disturbing. It still does, perhaps now more than ever. Now, some people think that Jesus taught in parables to make certain that sophisticated theological ideas could be understood even by little children, except that he was telling them to adults that we call the disciples. And he did send them away scratching their heads and wondering if they had perhaps chosen the wrong teacher to follow. Surely there was a more straightforward teacher out there somewhere, an old-fashioned teacher of righteousness who knew the value of a good study guide. I mean, please, just give us some theological cheat sheet, some handout listing the 8 rungs up the ladder of glory, so that we'll know exactly what's going to be on the test. Is this going to be on the test? And while you're at it, an embossed addendum listing all the cabinet members in the new Jesus administration. Spoiler alert, Peter will be president, Judas will be treasurer. Instead, he said, according to Luke, why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? Now there's an idea. Now this does not mean you'll always be right, of course, but that no one else can hand over the truth to you and then pass the collection plate. So I would like for you to consider my words today to be not what I'm trying to hand over to you, as if that would even work, but rather as a disturbance, meant to encourage you to be bold in your questioning and even bolder in your search for answers. It will get you into trouble, but I think if you mean well, if your intentions are good, it will get you into what the late, great John Lewis called good trouble. I do not believe in God as a supreme being, but rather in what radical theologian Paul Tillich called the ground of being, and then later on called being itself. But Jack Caputo takes this a step further to add what he calls the event, which is the fact of existence itself, the fact that there's something here instead of nothing, which is really quite astonishing, and the arrival of a value system that not only tries to keep us all from killing one another, but actually can inspire us to love one another. So here is the move in radical theology. If you're taking notes, this would be when, always say, and here are the 3 things that are going to be on the test. The students all grab their pens. From supreme being, number 1, from supreme being to ground of being, and then from ground of being to the event, where being's worth is affirmed. Another more academic way to say this is that we're moving from being's cause, which we call theology, to being's ground, which we call ontology, to being's worth, which we call axiology. That's what Caputo calls the royal road to radical theology. And Starkey loved Caputo. Now, you may wonder what radical theologians do all day. That's a fair question, besides give clever lectures. First, if it is truly radical theology, then it will move us inescapably to radical forms of life, especially when it comes to the other, whose treatment, said Emmanuel Levinas, is the basis of all ethical deliberation. As such, radical theology sometimes will drive us into the streets because it is not purely an intellectual pastime. Radical theology is also a praxis, a spiritual practice that knows, for example, exactly what it means to say Black Lives Matter. It is also, I would argue, a form of prayer, though not exactly the same sort of prayer that is often led by His Reverence in the local house of worship. Being a pastor for 35 years in the same church taught me many things, but none is more crystal clear to me than this. When it comes to love and compassion, all clarity comes in the doing of peace and justice work, and no clarity comes merely by the consideration of doing peace and justice work, which is why so many churches identify problems, form committees to study the problems, then when they think they've got all their data, they publish their report, they file it, they put it away and think, we have made progress in solving this problem. Soren Kierkegaard understood this better than anyone. As I said upstairs, concept is not capacity. So what, you may ask, does one gain from deciding that one is a non-theist? Let's say you wake up one morning and you think, I don't think I'm a theist. I think I'm a non-theist. And by the way, if you tell people you're non-theist, they'll say, oh, that's interesting, tell me more. If you just say it, I'm an atheist, that's the end of the conversation. So I'm going to suggest from a language standpoint, you say, I'm a non-theist, if indeed you are. First of all, saying I'm an atheist is just a thorn in the flesh of theists, or is a big-time disappointment to your grandmother. It means that you do not reject theism intellectually, please understand this, but existentially you reject it. To explore this further, let me return to Tillich for a moment. He thought there were 2 kinds of theologians. One we might call bridge builders, who think we must build a bridge from the world to God, and then hope that we can provide enough support to hold up the bridge. The second we might call ground diggers, who think no bridge is necessary because God is the very ground on which we stand. But we have to do a little digging to see that. The ground diggers think that the bridge builders are building a bridge to nowhere, for God is already here. And they understand themselves to be like archaeologists, sort of unearthing hidden treasures. Tillich thought Thomas Aquinas was a bridge builder and that Augustine was a ground digger. Tillich follows Augustine as radical theologians follow Tillich. If we have to find God, which we do, that is not because God is an alien being, a supreme being outside of time and space, but because we are alienated from God and do not realize that God is that in which we already live and move and have our being, to recall the words of Paul on Mars Hill. Radical theology recovers what was never lost, acquires what we already possess, to become who we already are. Do not go looking abroad for God, Augustine said. God is not far. God is right here, God within us, or we within God waiting to be found. Tillich also called God the unconditional. This is a kind of familiar Tillich term, the unconditional. He said that God was unconditional, but the unconditional is not God. Now that takes a little explaining. It's an enigma. The unconditional is the condition of everything else, but nothing is the condition of it. Tillich says God is the unconditional, which is how God is God, but the unconditional itself cannot be shut up inside a word or a being, even a supreme being. Furthermore, there may be other applicants for the job. God has held that position for a long time, but Caputo says that God could, in principle, be voted out of office. A materialist, for example, thinks this office should be held by matter. Nowadays, the leading candidate of the AI people, artificial intelligence, think it should be information. The name of God, Tillich says, is a symbol of the unconditional. It is a particular historical construction, like a cross or a crescent and star or a hammer and sickle. Of ancient lineage, no doubt, but still datable and locatable and in principle replaceable. This would be a good time to pause to say a word about the word symbol. Namely, that symbols are to be taken very seriously. Nothing is ever just a symbol. They are not arbitrary contrivances, but have paid their way, having been forged in the fires of history. They have earned their place as the concrete, sensuous, and inspiring ways we give words and images to matters which, as Tillich says, are matters of ultimate concern. Of course, they're not the same as what they symbolize, but they participate so fully in what they point to as to sometimes become indistinguishable from it. Just take the never-ending drama over the American flag and the histrionics of lawmakers who would make it illegal to burn one, even though to burn one, however disrespectful it might seem, is proof of the reality to which that flag points. When symbols do break down or lose their power, it's not because they've been refuted by some logical argument back in the faculty lounge, but because they've died away in the streets, lost their power to give word and image to our bonds with being. And the community can no longer recognize itself in them. Again, take our flag as a good example, which has become, as you all know, a weapon in the culture wars. Do I display a flag or do I not display a flag? What does that mean? People will think I'm saying. And which has simultaneously caused many otherwise patriotic people to somehow think of it as toxic. As in, well, how many flags can you get in the bed of a pickup truck? And why do we wear flags as underwear? And that's a good question. And it's very disrespectful. As for God being a symbol of the unconditional, our problem is that no one has ever directly met or experienced the unconditional for two very good reasons. First, with the unconditional, all the conditions under which experience is made possible have been removed. Second, the unconditional is not a particular thing we could ever meet, but the underlying source of support of the things we do meet. Their background or element or presupposition or condition. This is a little Caputo, so I'm sorry. But when conditional beings try to speak of the unconditional, they lack both the awareness and the vocabulary to do so. There was a cartoon in the New Yorker some years ago in which an older fish greets two younger fish by asking them, "How's the water, boys?" And after the old fish swims away, one young fish asks the other, "What the hell is water?" To put this in terms of quantum physics, especially as I've mentioned, I guess ad nauseum, something called quantum entanglement, the unconditional is like a field, where a thing is an excitation of the field, but cannot be separated from the field. In what has been called the most important and profound discovery in all of physics, it was observed that when subatomic particles decay and divide, they become a set of twins. A single system with two parts spinning in opposite directions. If the spin of one is reversed, the spin of the other will reverse also, no matter how far apart those particles travel, suggesting that there is some kind of instantaneous superluminal communication between quantum particles that exceeds the speed of light. There is no known explanation for this. It's something which Einstein himself could not explain and which troubled him greatly. If something troubles Einstein, it's trouble, since it violated his own special theory of relativity, which says nothing can happen faster than the speed of light. So he and his colleagues at Princeton tried repeatedly to disprove quantum entanglement, but they never succeeded. So with Einstein's characteristic humor, he called it spooky action at a distance. And that was that. As an aside, I kind of have to say this. I wish that, like scientists, more theologians would try actively to disprove their own theories. But that would be another, instead of defending them long after they become cartoons. That's another lecture. My point is that science is not the enemy, and it is not going to pull the plug on the whole theological enterprise. In fact, as I mentioned again in the sermon, science is now the leading source of awe and wonder, which is where the religious impulse is born. Now, science, besides trying to save us from this pandemic, that is before we land in the hospital, is also showing us an infinite universe of incomprehensible interconnectedness and entanglement that has profound theological implications. Everything we do, from the smallest choices, like holding the door open for someone, changes something, which changes something else, which changes something else, which can change everything. Because apparently no variable is too small to affect the outcome of complex systems. That's called chaos theory. Or, if a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, will it cause a tornado in West Texas? You could call that chaos theory, or you might call it God. Perhaps, since I already said I don't know anything about what I'm talking about, perhaps, as I wrote in my last book, God is not pulling the strings, God is the string. Which I guess would make string theory positively divine. What if, I wondered, God doesn't do anything, but without God nothing gets done? All right, let's return to Tillich for a moment. He said something very important about God in 1946. Namely that, quote, God is no object for us as subjects. God is always that which precedes this division. But on the other hand, we speak about God and we act upon God and we cannot avoid it because everything which becomes real to us, humans, enters the subject-object correlation. Out of this paradoxical situation, Tillich wrote, the half-blasphemous and mythological concept of the existence of God has arisen, and so have the abortive attempts to prove the existence of this object. To such a concept, Tillich wrote, and to such attempts, atheism is the right religious and theological reply. Boom. Caputo thought this passage should be hung in the main entrance of every school of theology and seminary in the land. And he would make seminarians memorize it on their first day under threat of corporal punishment. Because, he went to Catholic schools, and he remembers the nuns who used to rap him on the knuckles with rulers to keep him in line. So to be clear, Caputo, whom I hasten to remind you again, John Starkey loved, if you're going to give a speech on non-theism, always cover yourself with John Starkey. I know what I'm doing here. Is saying that the first move in becoming someone who gives her life to God is to no longer believe that God exists as other things exist. So again, the move is from supreme being to ground of being to being itself, and finally to the event. about which I'll say more in a few minutes. In the early 1960s, when the famous atheist Madalyn Murray O'Hair filed suit to stop compulsory prayers in California public schools and then won in the Supreme Court, she was called, quote, the most hated woman in America. To this day, conservatives sort of date the decline of America to this moment that, as they put it, God got kicked out of the classroom. Meanwhile, of course, children went right on praying, especially before their algebra test. Now, I know what you're thinking. So how do persons like us pray to something that is not a person? I am hardly against prayer, but I am against prayer as a wink or a weapon. But suffice it to say, Tillich does not intend for this atheism to be the end of theology, but rather the beginning of a new theology, a deeper post-theistic theology. In other words, his atheism and my own is a theological critique of theology. It represents a theology of theism transcended, or the first step in establishing what he calls radical theology. As most of you know, the most well-known critique of theism is called pantheism, a word that theists everywhere love to hate, because it represents the politically correct, but they think profoundly heretical death of the sovereign God, and thus the end of religion as we have known it. Well, newsflash, we are living through the death of religion as we have known it. And I believe that our God concepts and our God language are the primary cause. I used to think it was mostly our disagreements over Jesus that divided us, and I wrote most of my books about the historical Jesus, because I think he was the most misunderstood figure in human history. But now I begin to wonder if the real taboo subject these days is not God, and our God concept, and our well-intentioned but sometimes horrific claims about what this God is up to in the world. One example might drive this point home. After one of the horrible tornadoes tore through Moore, Oklahoma, it literally sucked an infant out of its mother's arms as she huddled praying in her bathtub, holding on to her child as tightly as she could. When her baby was found, wrapped in a tree a quarter-mile away, like so much storm debris, a pastor came calling and trying to be helpful and to comfort her. He told the mother that everything was going to be okay because God just wanted her baby to arrive in heaven early. Now, if I had been that mother, you would have had to physically restrain me from attempting strangulation. And that's when I wonder if religion can survive its own practitioners. Back to pantheism, enough tornadoes. Back to pantheism. Although pantheism infuriates theists, it is also, like atheism, notoriously misunderstood. Caputo wrote, quote, pantheism does not mean that the broken lawnmower in your garage is God, or that old Uncle Henry is God. It means that things have a depth dimension. Everything, pan, does. Just so long as we are paying attention, being mindful instead of being mindless. And for the religious sensibility, it is this depth dimension which is divine. This depth dimension really means that the pan in pantheism means anything can be magic. Take anything in your life, the humbler the better. I, for one, like the way coffee brewing in the morning smells and fills the house with the aroma of higher consciousness. Always make your coffee before you go to bed, for it's quite the luxury just to flip the switch in the morning. I like the way my dog looks at me, as if to say, get a life, human. And remember, dog is God spelled backwards, as my wife frequently reminds me. Or I like it when one of my granddaughters rolls her eyes at Rapa, which is their name for me, because I seem like such a hopeless antique. Oh, Rapa, they say, let it go. After having watched Frozen for the 450th time, they can sing that song with all the words. For Marcel Proust, it was a cup of tea and the little French sponge cake called a Madeleine. For the poet Mary Oliver, it was everything on her morning walk that called out to her to be seen for what it is, the backlight of creation. I'm willing to bet that it was what the disciples saw on the face of Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. If you have eyes to see, everything is on fire. Everything, said Annie Dillard, is luminescent. Now, around here, we celebrate the arts, don't we? But not because we're just artsy-fartsy types, but rather because art mediates transcendence. It's not what we're doing to avoid real work, dancing and painting and singing and playing music and acting. This is the real work of paying attention to the work we do, to what is indescribably beautiful about the gift of creation itself, a song to our astonishment that there is anything at all instead of nothing at all, including ourselves and those people we love. Religion ought to be, Aaron Copland-like, a fanfare for the common everything. Walt Whitman was practicing radical theology when he taught us that faith is not about becoming one with the one and then passing the collection plate, but rather remaining for as long as possible among the many, which is the ground of the one. Or as Woody Allen said, I do not want to live on in my works or live on in my children. I want to live on in my apartment. Radical theology is not an exercise in Neoplatonic escapism, but rather an escape from Neoplatonism. I was hoping Mark Davies might be here to hear that line. I'll report it to him. The undoing of the damage that Neoplatonism has done to the New Testament. That's why radical theology is not so much theology as it is theopoetics. Theopoetics. And that's why pastors should be reading more poetry than commentaries. Instead of the right reverend saying, let us all now look to the hills, whence cometh our help, she should say instead, please get out your magnifying glass from the pew rack in front of you, and let's look harder at what's right under our noses. Some of you may already be thinking that I should add a popular modifier to pantheism, namely panentheism, which is preferred by many, myself included. Namely, panentheism says that the divine is the depth dimension of reality, but the divinity is not equal to any single object which participates in that divinity. I like this idea, but I try to remember how important pantheism itself is as a critique of theism, how it drove orthodoxy crazy, which I've been accused of doing myself. Here's how Caputo puts it. The more the theists stress the ineffable transcendence of God in the highest, the more we whisper pantheism in their ear. They can't stand it, and too bad for them. They have spent several millennia trying to scare the daylights out of the rest of us with their supreme being, who is coming to get us on Judgment Day. So now we're just demanding equal time, Caputo wrote. What's fair is fair. They've been trying to sell us a theological bill of goods, an idea of God which is tended to make the things that take place in space and time look like a veil of tears, a time of trial, in exchange for which, if we can just put up with it and keep all the rules and be good, we will be rewarded with a heavenly banquet, just when we and our taste buds will all be good and dead. So, just to review, in radical theology, the name of God is not the name of a person, but of the ground of persons. That means the ground is not less than a person, but deeper, not impersonal, as if it tried to get as far as a person, but failed and ended up as a rock or a stone, but the very source from which persons in all their multifarious glory emerge. See, if required to fill out a census form, the ground of being would check every box. All of the above. White and not so white. Black and not so black. masculine and feminine, and all the innumerable and unforeseeable genders, transgenders, and ethnicities in between or yet to come. All of the above. And this gives me goosebumps, while an old man in the sky just gives me the creeps. Of course, the first objection raised by theists will always be, so what about prayer? Now there's nobody to pray to, and there's no religion without prayer. Well, as someone who did a lot of praying, even in public, which, as I said upstairs, is not a good idea, Jesus said, go into the closet and not pray out loud for other people to hear you. I never got quite there. I would argue there is no religion, however, if we keep praying like we do, which is often only slightly less fantastic than Janis Joplin's parody of prayer, Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? My friends all drive Porsches, I must make amends. Worked hard all my lifetime, no help from my friends. Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? Thank God she sang it. So to just reassure you that it is not a completely heretical task to ask someone who is a non-theist to give the Willson Lectures, I believe in prayer, and I think we ought to do it with our whole lives like mad. When Paul says we should pray without ceasing, well, we can't take that literally, or the dishes will never get done. Of course, we could use some better names for the ground of being, like Holy One, either H-O-L-Y, holy, or holy, W-H-O-L-L-Y, as in a nod to quantum physics, the Holy One, or Divine Mother, or Mystery of Mysteries. But we need to give our Father a break, just out of respect for our mothers. We might even try Elizabeth Johnson's suggestion, She Who Is, or Catherine Keller's Mother Earth, or The Face of the Deep. I love that, The Face of the Deep. Now this will raise eyebrows, of course, but then at least you'll know people are awake. One day, years ago at Mayflower, I referred to God from the pulpit for the very first time using a feminine pronoun. And an audible murmur rippled through the crowd. After church, a woman came up to me in the line after the service, and she was visibly upset. And she said, Robin, you don't really think God is a woman, do you? To which I responded, no, not literally, but I don't think God is a man either. So I thought, if I'm going to miss the mark rhetorically, I ought to miss it in a more egalitarian way. When she left, she was still not happy. Yes, non-theist radical theologians still pray, but they don't just bow their heads and raise their arms like so many clergy at the end of the service for the benediction, which has often seemed to be a little more about the image for the camera than a sign of humility. Prayer can be paying attention to your breathing, or to your walking, or to where in your life you have a deficit of kindness. And then, if you are lucky, you will be the answer to your own prayers. They will bubble up from the ground on which you stand, which is all holy, so we should take off our shoes permanently. To be clear, I'm not suggesting you place a long-distance call to the supreme somebody, but rather that you use personal terms when you pray, since we are persons, while also knowing that they are metaphors and analogies, as I'm sure St. Francis of Assisi knew when he composed his canticle to Brother, Sun, and Sister Moon. By the way, I saw a bumper sticker in a school parking lot that belonged to an English teacher, the English teacher's car, and it said, "Metaphors be with you." I really think that's good. But just don't forget, prayer can be wordless and dangerous, like making eye contact with someone on the street corner who is begging, regardless of whether you give that person anything. Because, well, you know, they might just buy booze with it. If John Starkey were here, I know what he would say, because he said this to me out of his Jesuit training. When someone begs from you, remember the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. They are very straightforward. Give to everyone who begs from you. It's right there. You can look it up. I wish it had said something a little more qualified. Give something maybe someday as long as the person doesn't misuse the gift. I don't know. That's not what it says. And Starkey went on to say that our responsibility is to respond to someone who needs something from us. We have to decide whether we're going to give. Our responsibility ends vis-a-vis what the person does with the gift. And I've never forgotten that. A reminder that the word prayer comes from precor, which is where we get the word precarious from. Prayer is precarious for mortals like us. So let's not waste it on who should win the Super Bowl or whether oil and gas is begotten of God. It's not. Although I don't believe, like most bumper stickers, I mean, I don't like bumper stickers, period, but I did like the one that said, don't believe everything you think. That's a good one. Or one I saw in California that was parodying political correctness that said, nuke the gay whales for Jesus. I like that one. I do think that if radical theology had a bumper sticker, it would be this: bubble up is better. Just consider for a moment what the concept that all land is holy does to the concept of the Holy Land. Or what the idea that God shows no partiality, to quote Peter, Simon Peter, but chooses all things and all persons in which to reside. Think what that does to the idea of the chosen people. Actual religious teaching is a continuous threat to what religion itself has become. To be clear, it is called radical theology for a very good reason. It seeks to put the supernatural attitude out of business. As for the one named Jesus, the one so many of us believe to be the definitive revelation of the ground of being, if you asked Jesus to explain God, as people often did, he would start talking about mustard seeds, not metaphysics. He was a theopoet and a prophet. He was not a philosopher. Prior to the very recent arrival of fundamentalism, the idea that the Bible was to be taken literally was just not a thing. Karl Barth is known to have said that he took the Bible too seriously to take it literally. I would argue that there is simply no such thing as a biblical literalist to begin with. There are no biblical literalists out there, only selective biblical literalists. For example, Jesus is often referred to as the Lamb of God, and as everyone knows, Mary did not have a little lamb. So remember, symbols are important, very important, but they are not the same as what they symbolize. For Christians, the whole point of theopoetics and radical theology is to approach Jesus without supernaturalizing him like classical theologians or naturalizing him like modern philosophers. By which I mean, he was not an alien, but neither do we think of him as just a very nice guy who had really wise things to say and met with an unfortunate and untimely end. Which is another way of saying that the historical Jesus movement can only take us so far. So that even if we succeed in demystifying Jesus, we come up well short of understanding him as a God-man who literally changed human history. That, to me, is the essential role of faith. Not to believe things you know are not true in order to get rewards you doubt are available, but rather to believe more than you can know with our tiny and still evolving brains so that we can aspire to follow and even imitate Jesus rather than turning him into a footnote. I do not believe Jesus was God, first of all, because that's heresy and has been since day one, but I do believe that some revelations are so clear and compelling that they leave nothing as it was before. And they open the door permanently to a new way of being in the world. For me, Jesus is the Christ, not because of how he came into the world or went out of it, or that he suspended natural law in performing the miracles, but because he is the supreme example of the idea expressed by Paul on Mars Hill, that God is not far. God is within us, among us, and we in God, because Messiah means, after all, God with us. So to wind this down and get to your questions, which I'll not be able to answer, let me say one last thing about a final move that radical theologians are making from supreme being to ground of being to what Caputo calls the event, by which he means not just what happened, but what is going on in what happens. So now we add interpretation and value to the equation. Another way to say this is that we move from being's cause, theism, to being's ground, panentheism, to being's worth, axiology. From theology to theopoetics, from being to event, okay? The primary event is, of course, the existence of the universe itself, which is where all theology should begin. Not with doctrines about the virgin birth or eschatology or the second coming, but the fact of creation itself is the astonishment. And besides the late great teacher of preaching, Fred Craddock, who taught at Phillips, and I just learned gave the Willson Lectures, said something unforgettable once to explain why people are so obsessed with the second coming. Robin, he said, maybe deep down they were really disappointed in the first one. The event is a package deal, beginning with astonishment that there's anything at all instead of nothing at all. Why are we here in this room among sentient creatures, having a conversation about why anything is here, ourselves included? That is astonishing. That is the event. The Big Bang calls to us from out of the past, but also calls us into the future, because as humans, we assign meaning to the event, because we want to know where we came from, where we are going, and to whom or to what, if anything, we belong. The event is the source of our hope beyond hope, our hope not just for this thing or that thing, but for life itself, especially when all seems hopeless. And it can feel that way a lot lately. That's how people fall into despair. When Jean-Paul Sartre said that existence precedes essence, it comes from the heart of his existentialism. For human beings, there is no predefined pattern we must fit into. We live our lives, and that in turn defines what we truly are, not any idealized set of characteristics. For a conceptual example, we have always assumed that the existence of democracy preceded the essence of democracy we practice in the United States. It has come down to us as an ideal, and we just assume it's a superior way of organizing human affairs, and it will always prevail. Now we have experienced our own democracy as having very nearly perished. Last January, when a mob attacked the U.S. Capitol in the name of Jesus, no less. We know that we have been busy destroying democracy for decades, of course, mostly through the corrupting influence of money. But we witnessed it almost vanish before our eyes. So, is democracy a pre-existent ideal that is yet not perfected, or do the events of January 6th demand our interpretation and our deliberation? We must not stand aside, assuming it's all in God's hands, because we are God's hands. God is not the answer, God is the question. God is the call to which we must respond, the question to which we should be the answer. God is not the answer to our prayers, we're supposed to be the answers to God's. So the final move of radical theology is to know that our response to the event is to consider God to be not just being itself, but possibility itself. What is really possible with God, about whom we like to say that with God all things are possible? Including, as it now seems likely, the death of democracy. Before Christianity became a bitter argument over who's saved and who's lost, it was a vision, a theopoetic. And the central question was, what would the world look like if justice and mercy reigned instead of the empire? Or what the Bible calls the principalities and the powers. Or as I said once at Yale, how is it that the church that once gave the empire now fits right in with the empire? The answer, well, we find membership in the empire to be as irresistible as our cell phones, no matter how they're made or under what conditions. Which is why the church as a collection of frightened believers will continue to be a relic of irrelevance, like a story on the evening news about a 100-year-old lady eating cake in a nursing home, until we decide to do something for God, like recovering our original identity as pacifists. You want to know how I think the church comes back? All Christians are pacifists. I mean, that would get the attention of the empire. If we really want to be relevant, woke, we need to do more than serve Starbucks coffee or host Christian aerobics. We have to put down our weapons and refuse to pick them up. And as I said, that will get the attention of the empire almost immediately. Or take the human-induced existential disaster that is global climate change. A planetary death watch that dwarfs all our other problems because, well, you have to be alive to have other problems. What if people of faith did not drive the biggest trucks with the biggest tailpipes and say, drill, baby, drill, but instead led the conversion to renewable energy by actually refusing to use non-renewable energy whenever possible? Well, they'd be in the dark, people say. What is truly dark is the future for our children and grandchildren if we do nothing. I need not remind you that the folks who support the best neighborhoods for white people, no homeland for the Palestinians, and continued separation of the races by any means necessary have forgotten quite a few of the most important passages of Scripture that they claim to revere. None the least of which the words of Paul. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Lovely idea, until someone who doesn't look like you moves in next door. Radical theology is radical thinking, and radical thinking is radical living. And axiology is a discourse upon what is of worth, and what could be of more worth than determining whether we live in a way that is worthy. Here we are, so what shall we do with the worthiness of being itself? Faith is not a certificate, it's an assignment. Easter is not about playing dress-up, serving ham loaf, and overusing the exclamation mark. It's about the astonishment once felt, which can still be felt, not in the propositional statement, he is risen, but in the fear and trembling of the women who first intuited the resurrection. In the sermon, I said a better expression for Easter might be, oh no, he's back. So, the name of God is the name of an event that lays claim to us unconditionally, which in turn shifts the burden to us to respond to this claim, to realize what is being called for, to make ourselves unconditionally worthy of what is going on in that name, and that remains to be seen. As Caputo put it, in an axiology, showing God's existence depends on whether we show up. To close, let me say one last time, growing up, I would often hear preachers say, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And maybe you think that's what I'm saying. To which I would reply that since foolishness is a lack of wisdom, or having your heart in the wrong place, or pursuing what is unworthy of being itself, then what I see now is a ship of fools who are more likely to be in church than out of it. Since what you desire, that's your ultimate concern, that is your God, the true atheism might better be described as a life in heedless pursuit of material wealth, or truth as the acquisition of power, or ethics as a set of rules you get to ignore, or faith as creedal correctness, or art as whatever the market demands, or the earth as a vast warehouse of exploitable natural resources, or sex as power instead of tenderness, or sports as sound and fury signifying nothing, or systemic racism as America's original and continuing sin. This cacophony of the worship of the unworthy is the true atheism. A toxic blasphemy that occurs when we receive the gift of creation as if we deserve to be here and then shop until we drop. Creation carries moral obligations unless, of course, we made the universe and ourselves. Because where your heart is and where you spend your money, there is your God. Perhaps we could reset the whole idea of worship so that our hearts are in this world, that our eyes are not cast far off into the heavens. As Gerald Manley Hopkins put it, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. For me, it's the love of family, the privilege of teaching my students, the trust and support of my friends, the light of early October. How perfect is it out there? And the certainty of death, which only makes all of it more poignant and precious. I expect nothing from God beyond what God's creation has already provided. And what an entangled universe, which is the true body of God, verifies to me minute by minute that no good deed goes unrewarded, and that either all of us matter or none of us do. That's what's made a believer out of me. Thank you all so very much. It was only about 10 minutes too long.
I think we can go ahead and take some questions, though I'll let students be excused because I know some have to get on to 4 o'clock classes. But if there's anybody who has a question, I'll bring the microphone around so we're sure that the online recording picks it up. So do we have a question or two?
We have a question from online, from Nash Carey. So
Oh,
several of us
student?
know.
Oh.
Yes. Get ready. Okay. He says that quantum entanglement and how our energies impact each other is problematic in a world. Would you say this? Okay, would you say this, that quantum entanglement and how our energies impact each other is problematic in a world of misinformation and social networking? How does God work in an age of algorithms and capitalistic leveraging of masses?
Okay, that's a Nash Carey question.
That is? Yes.
Hi, Nash. I see you out there somewhere. I'm not meaning to say, Nash, that the consequences are all good ones. We're the ones that are responsible for the algorithms in, what's the Facebook app, the Instagram, that's so harmful for young girls. We're the ones that spread misinformation about the vaccine. It's not God that's doing that. We're doing that. We don't respond to the gifts we have appropriately, so we turn loose a lot of evil in the world. We do it. So the fact that quantum entanglement could go either way, can produce good results or bad results, is what I believe. I talk more about the good ones, that's what I like to focus on. But if you look around, there's a lot of bad consequences. But they're our consequences. And apparently, creation has been ordered in such a way that good things very often produce good results, bad things, selfish things, mean things produce bad results. So we're the ones who decide.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Not at all theologian or practical, but what would you say about the craziness, I think the craziness of the U.S. to want to put a man on the moon and to fly off into outer space?
Well, I mean, as a child of the Apollo age, I was pretty thrilled by the desire to explore and to go out. I mean, if we hadn't gone to the moon the first time, we wouldn't have the picture, the most important photograph of all time, Earthrise, which launched the modern environmental movement. I think the need to explore and the desire to explore, if it's not to go out and find some more minerals to mine and somehow ship back, is a good thing. I think that's in our nature. The problem with what we're doing now with sort of privatization of space exploration is that it's becoming a kind of space tourism, and it ends up being about the money. Everything ends up being about the money. And America won't recover anything like its potential until it talks openly again about virtue. We have to become virtuous people again. We have to put something ahead of ourselves and our own careers and our own money, or we're going to just destroy one another. And we're fast on our way to doing that. So that's what I would say about space exploration. I like it, but I don't want to buy any space rocks when they get back.
So, Robin, what kind of afterlife can we expect?
I don't know. No, I really mean, to that question, of all questions, I spent my whole ministry telling people, I don't know. I don't know what happens to people when they die. That doesn't mean nothing happens. That doesn't mean something wonderful may not happen. I'm kind of doubtful something horrible happens because I just have this feeling that a God of unconditional love would not make and operate a place of eternal torment. But I do believe that energy just changes forms. I don't know why I came into the world now, into this body. But when I go out of it, there's nothing to suggest that I don't get to come around again, even though I'll never know I was here before. But there's something about the difference between soul and body that's fascinating to me. The traditional Orthodox views that good people get to go to some kind of paradise where they cavort with other good people is just means nothing to me. But of course I could be wrong. That's exactly what may happen. And bad people may go to hell and burn forever. I hope I'm right about this. So I don't know what happens.
So you were mentioning about God not having personal relationships. And to me, the concept of Trinity means God is a relationship. So can you kind of make that
Oh
distinction?
gosh, the Trinity discussion could last a long time. People who know me know that I'm not a Trinitarian, and that although I understand it as a way of understanding the activity of God at one time, that it was a signpost, but it shouldn't be a hitching post. So the problem with God, Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit is not that those aren't kind of theopoetics of their own. These are three ways we understand the activity of God, but what the institution of the church did with the Trinity, that split the church into West and East, that was over the Trinity. So is the Holy Spirit a sort of independent contractor? Or can it only come through the Father and the Son? The West said that, yes. The East said no. So there we are splitting millions of Christians apart on the Trinity. So one of the things I don't like about the Trinity, other than the math of it is clearly impossible, so we know it's a metaphor, I don't like the way the Trinity has been used to acquire power and divide people if they're not Trinitarians. But I can see the Trinity being, for some people, a very useful metaphor for ways that we experience God. If we could just keep the bureaucrats out of it.
Thank you. Other questions? Dr. Musselman?
Okay. If anybody ever asked me to summarize your talk this afternoon, I would kill them. I'm wondering about this. I'm a very simple person when it comes to what you're talking about. Would it be sufficient for a person to believe in three things? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Love thy neighbor as thyself. And a third one, which I came upon recently, is an expression, the name of a South African tribe. That means it's Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. If we were to take those three things, would they be the tripod for the stool on which we sit for our religion?
Yes. I couldn't say it any better than that. That's praxis. That is religious practice. We don't do a lot of religious practice. We do a lot of religious pontificating. Lloyd lives in my neighborhood. We see each other a lot.
We'll take one more from online.
Yes, thank you.
national.
It's not. This is from Richard Miller online. Do you recommend any radical theology books other than those you mentioned in your lecture?
Well, I think it's a kind of new field. It's kind of new. I think so. Caputo is the first person to read. If I can get that person, I'll get a little annotated bibliography to that person about radical theology. But start with Jack Caputo. He's working on this book called What is Radical Theology? And he sent me his manuscript to look at and say, what do you think of this? And I read it and I thought it was so good that I thought, oh, I'll just steal half of it for the Willson Lectures. Whereupon I did. So yeah, there isn't a long list now under the rubric radical theology, but I think that's coming, especially if Caputo keeps growing in stature and wisdom.
Well, thank you very much for your lecture and for your There is one more lecture this evening at 7 o'clock in this same location, either here in Watson Lounge or online, so please join us if you're able. Thank you.